Greetings, friends, and welcome to the Creation Soapbox, brought to you by your friends here at abitoforange.com. Last time, we saw that Darwin had failed. We had presented the case, we had looked at the evidence, and we had seen Darwin had failed. There are no mechanisms that grow the Darwinian tree of life, and therefore no natural way to account for it. There are only mechanisms that cut branches off, which is the exact opposite of what evolution needs to explain. Darwin's tree is dead wood. Well, we could burn it and roast some marshmallows, but I think the metaphor breaks down at that point. So, if life on Earth can't be explained by an unguided natural process, well, what does that leave? It leaves a guided process, an intelligent designer. In the first book of the Bible, we're told that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and he created everything else. And we're going to look at that in some detail to understand the biblical creation model. If life didn't make itself, somebody had to make it, and here we are. Biblical creation fact number 1, Jesus is our creator. Let's take a look at the scriptures and see how that's true. In John chapter 1, it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Now right off the bat there, the Word was with God and the Word was God. John is referring here to the Trinity, which is a doctrine far more complicated than I can get into right now, but check it out, look it up, it's biblical. Now, he's referring to Jesus as the Word, the Logos, the mind. Again, a very deep concept that I'm not going to explain now, but check it out, look it up, it's interesting. And he says, "He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made." So very clearly here, referring to Jesus, he's saying that Jesus is the Son of God who was with God the Father, and who is God, and through him everything was made. He is our creator. This is reinforced in Colossians chapter 1. "For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. Whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together." Hebrews chapter 1 says, "In the past God spoke to our ancestors and through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, Jesus, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom also he made the universe." So very clearly over and over, the New Testament is reaffirming Jesus is our creator, the creator of the universe. Biblical creation fact number 2, Genesis is a book of history. People calling themselves Christians who want to defend the idea of billions of years or evolution will say things like, well, the Bible is not a science textbook. And that to me seems like a silly comment because nobody in the world is saying, the Bible is a science textbook. But what do they mean? Well, they mean that you shouldn't be trying to learn science from the Bible. Okay, well that's fair, but the Bible is a history book. And as a history book, it's telling us what happened in the past. Genesis, like all of the Old Testament, relates real events happening in real places to real people. Adam and Eve are in the genealogy of Jesus, and of course, of everybody else. The New Testament, of course, reaffirms this in Acts 17. "The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands, and he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man, he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands." From one man here is referring, of course, to Adam. So the biblical creation account in a nutshell. First, in the beginning, roughly 6,000 years ago, God made the heavens and the earth. Over the next 6 days, he made all the kinds of plant and animal that exist today. Keep in mind, kind is a bigger category than species. I will talk about this in some detail in the future, but essentially what I'm saying is, we're not claiming that God made the poodle and the chihuahua. God made the dog kind, and the poodle and chihuahua are descended from the original created dog kind. 2 humans, Adam and Eve, were made special in God's image, and they are the first parents of all humanity. Around 1,000 years later, the flood upsets and resets the world, and all land life starts new. Biblical creation fact number 3, and a fact that should be so obvious that if it weren't for the internet, I wouldn't even have to say it. Genesis is not a metaphor for evolution. Biblical evolution? What? There are a lot of people really determined to try to accept evolution and deep time as scientific fact, and therefore to wedge them somehow into the creation account. Well, let's see what Jesus had to say about it. In Mark 10, he says, "But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. So Jesus is referring, of course, to Genesis 1:27. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Jesus is saying God created men and women, male and female, Adam and Eve, in the beginning of creation. And Jesus says from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. So Jesus is putting the creation of Adam and Eve at the beginning of creation. Well, can we match that to the evolutionary timeline? No, because the creation of Adam and Eve, our first parents, the beginning of the human race, on the evolutionary timeline is way over there on the right, where it says modern humans evolved, somewhere in Japan. Now, this is the time scale of the evolutionary Big Bang cosmology here. So on this scale, 1 inch is 16 years, and it would take most of the Earth's circumference to lay it out in a straight line. On this model, the beginning of creation is the Big Bang event over on the coast of California, 13-some billion years before the first humans. So, in trying to say that Jesus or the Bible are putting creation and evolution on the same timeline and saying, well, they're kind of the same thing said in a different way, Jesus just said that the creation of Adam and Eve are at the beginning of creation, which is over there in California at the Big Bang, the beginning of creation. Whereas the first people are way over there on the right side. Now, if this were the creation timeline, it would be a whole lot shorter. It'd be 30 feet instead of several thousands of miles. The creation event and the creation of humans are only a couple of days apart. The distance you would have to travel on that 30-foot timeline to get from the beginning of creation to the creation of Adam and Eve a couple days later is less than the thickness of a piece of paper. So, it is not at the moment of creation, but it certainly is at the beginning. So the New Testament is very consistent with saying that Genesis is to be taken literally. Jesus and his disciples all refer to Genesis as real history. But so does the Old Testament. Let's see what God said to Moses. Now here's Exodus 20, verses 1 and then 8 through 11. I include verse 1 because we tend to forget that the Ten Commandments are referred to as God spoke all these words. Otherwise, we tend to think of the Ten Commandments as Moses came up with some good ideas and wrote them down and read them off to the people. Exodus 20 tells us that what follows are the words of God. God spoke all these words. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. So God spoke all these words. In 6 days, the Lord made the heavens and the earth. God is saying to Moses and his people that the Genesis account is history. It is real, literal history. It is an actual 6 days of creation. When people reject this as the actual interpretation of verses like this, they wind up saying all kinds of ridiculous and frequently heretical things. There are people who are in charge of publishing companies, or teaching pastors, or Christian recording artists who say ridiculous and heretical things like, well, maybe God doesn't really understand how time works because he's not in time like we are. Like, so you're going to claim that God created the heavens and the earth, which includes time, but he doesn't really understand how it works? I don't know how to respond to that with language that's appropriate. Suffice it to say, no. Jesus and his disciples and the words of God spoken to Moses and a variety of other things all support that Genesis is literal history recorded as it was meant to be recorded, that in the beginning, about 6,000 years ago, God took a week and created the heavens and the earth and all of life as we know it. Think about it, won't you? I hope you enjoyed this Bit of Orange. If you want to see more, check us out at abitoforange.com and of course on our YouTube channel. As always, thanks for watching. And remember, Jesus loves you.